This presentation contains depictions of violence, murder, and dismemberment that are central to the ancient myth. Viewer discretion is advised. How do you kill a god? You don't just murder him. You chop him into 14 pieces and scatter them across the entire nation, ensuring he can never be made whole again. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was an act of cosmic annihilation, designed to erase a king not just from the world of the living, but from existence itself. And the most chilling part? It was all orchestrated by his own brother. This is the story of a betrayal so profound it shattered the heavens and a love so powerful it defied death itself. It's a story of a throne won by blood, a queen who would scour the earth for the fragments of her husband, and a son born of magic, destined for one thing: revenge. But in their quest to reassemble their fallen king, they would discover one piece was lost forever. A piece so vital that its absence would fundamentally change the nature of the afterlife and spark a war that would rage for 80 years. What was that one missing piece, and how did its loss create the very concept of the final judgment that would echo for millennia? To understand the darkness, you must first understand the light it extinguished. Before the blood and the betrayal, there was a golden age. Imagine a time when the world was new, a paradise forged by the gods. The earth was impossibly fertile, the sun perfectly warm, and the Nile River, the lifeblood of civilization, flowed with a gentle, predictable rhythm. Humanity was young, living like wild animals, without law, without culture, without purpose. And ruling over this nascent world was the god-king Osiris. Osiris was not a tyrant. He was a teacher. He was the bringer of civilization, the one who taught humanity how to cultivate wheat and barley, how to brew beer and bake bread. He gave them laws, music, and the knowledge of the gods. He was handsome, charismatic, and benevolent. Under his rule, Egypt wasn't just a kingdom. It was a Garden of Eden. There was no war, no famine, no suffering. There was only peace and abundance. He was loved, not feared. He was a symbol of life, order, and stability. By his side ruled his sister wife, the goddess Isis. If Osiris was the benevolent king, Isis was the brilliant architect of their reign. She was a master of magic, wiser than any other god or mortal. Her power was not in brute force, but in her intellect, her cunning, and her unwavering devotion. She was the perfect queen, the throne behind the throne, whose words could heal the sick and whose spells could shape reality itself. Together, Osiris and Isis were a perfect union, a divine power couple who embodied the harmony and prosperity of the entire world. They were the very definition of a golden age. But no paradise is without its serpent. And in this story, the serpent was their own brother, Set. Set was the god of the desert, of chaos, storms, and violence. Where Osiris represented the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley, Set was the harsh, unforgiving red land that surrounded it. He was everything his brother was not: wild, unpredictable, and consumed by a ferocious strength. He was a warrior, a force of nature, but in a world of perfect peace, what is a warrior to do? While the people sang praises to Osiris for the harvest, they feared Set for the raging storm. He was respected for his power, but he was never loved. And in the shadow of his brother's perfect kingdom, a bitter seed of jealousy began to grow. He watched the adoration in the eyes of mortals and gods alike as they looked upon Osiris. He saw the perfect harmony between his brother and Isis. He saw a king who had everything, and he, Set, felt like a forgotten power, a second-born son relegated to the barren wastes while his brother ruled paradise. This wasn't just political ambition. This was a deep, personal, festering resentment. It was the primal rage of the shadow self, yearning to extinguish the light that cast it. He wasn't alone in his darkness. He had a wife, their sister Nephthys. She was a goddess of the shadows, a mirror to Isis's light, but she was not evil. She was conflicted, caught between her loyalty to her sister and her duty to her volatile husband. She saw the darkness growing in Set, the way his eyes would narrow whenever Osiris's name was spoken. She felt the tremors of his rage, but she was powerless, or perhaps unwilling, to stop the cataclysm she knew was coming. The plan Set devised was as cunning as it was cruel. He knew he couldn't challenge Osiris in open combat. Osiris was too beloved. The other gods would never stand for it. No, this had to be a different kind of murder. It had to be an assassination wrapped in a celebration, a betrayal disguised as a gift. Set commissioned the most skilled craftsman in the world to build a chest. It was a masterpiece, constructed from the finest cedar wood, and inlaid with breathtaking patterns of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. It was more than a box, it was a work of art, a sarcophagus fit for a god. But its beauty concealed a deadly secret. It was built to one person's exact measurements, the measurements of his brother Osiris. With his trap prepared, Set announced he would be hosting a magnificent banquet in his brother's honor. He invited all the gods and goddesses to a celebration unmatched in its splendor. The finest food, the sweetest wine, the most beautiful music, nothing was spared. Osiris, having no reason to suspect his own brother, accepted the invitation without a second thought. He saw it as a gesture of reconciliation, a chance to bridge the gap that had silently grown between them. He walked into his brother's palace full of hope, completely unaware that he was walking into his own tomb. The feast was legendary. The gods drank and laughed, celebrating the peace and prosperity of the kingdom. As the night reached its peak, Set unveiled his grand surprise. He presented the magnificent chest to the assembled guests, its surface gleaming under the torchlight. He declared that this incredible prize would be a gift to whoever could fit perfectly inside it. One by one the gods tried. A muscular god found it too narrow. A slender goddess found it too long. Each guest took their turn, laughing as they failed to fit, treating it as a light-hearted party game. The entire spectacle was a symphony of deception, and Osiris was its unwitting conductor. Finally, it was the king's turn. Encouraged by the cheers of the crowd and his own brother's smiling face, Osiris stepped forward. He admired the chest's craftsmanship, oblivious to its true purpose. He lay down inside it, and as his body settled, he found that it was a perfect fit, as if it had been made just for him. And in that moment, as a triumphant smile crossed Osiris's face, the trap was sprung. Before he could react, Set and his co-conspirators, 72 of them, slammed the heavy lid shut. The laughter in the hall died, replaced by a horrifying, echoing thud. They hammered nails into the lid, sealing it tight, transforming the beautiful gift into a prison of death. The other gods watched in stunned silence, their joy turning to terror as they realized what was happening. Osiris, the beloved king, the god of life, was trapped inside, his muffled cries for help swallowed by the wood and gold. Set's followers then poured molten lead into every crack, ensuring not a single breath of air could enter. The gilded cage had become a coffin. But for Set, this was not enough. To simply suffocate his brother was too simple. He needed to make a statement. He and his followers hoisted the chest onto their shoulders, marched it out of the palace, and with a final act of desecration, hurled it into the dark, churning waters of the Nile River. The gilded coffin struck the water with a sound that was swallowed by the roar of the Nile. For a moment it bobbed on the surface, a golden scar on the black water, before the current seized it, pulling it under, and carrying it away into the darkness. Back in the great hall, a stunned silence fell, broken only by the triumphant, drunken laughter of Set and his co-conspirators. The music had stopped. The dancing had ceased. The joy of the festival had curdled into horror. What becomes of a kingdom when its heart is ripped out in front of its own court? Panic. Chaos. Some guests fled, terrified of the new violent power that had just declared itself. Others, loyal to Osiris, drew their weapons, only to be cut down by Set's hidden soldiers who now emerged from the shadows. The coup was swift, brutal, and absolute. Set, his hands still dripping with the Nile's water, ascended the steps to the empty throne. He sat down, the stone still warm from his brother, and declared himself the new king of Egypt. The age of gold and grain was over. The age of the red desert, of storm and violence, had begun. But amidst the terror and confusion, one sound cut through the din. It was not a cry of fear or a shout of anger. It was a scream of pure, undiluted agony, a sound of a soul being torn in two. It was Isis. She had watched it all. She had seen the lid slam shut. She had seen the nails hammered home. She had seen her husband, her brother, the love of her eternal life, betrayed and cast away like refuse. Her world didn't just crumble. It was annihilated in a single fiery instant. The goddess of magic, the great enchantress, was for a moment just a woman whose heart had been shattered. Her knees gave way and she collapsed, her hands clutching the cold floor where the chest had just been. Her sister, Nephthys, Set's own wife, rushed to her side, weeping in shame and terror for her husband's monstrous act. But Isis was inconsolable. Her grief was a physical thing. a storm that raged within her. She tore at her royal linens, the fine clothes of a queen now feeling like a cage. She ripped the crown from her head and cast it aside. She took dust and ash from the cold hearths and smeared it across her face, a traditional sign of the deepest mourning. She was no longer a queen. What was a throne without her king? What was a palace but a gilded tomb? In the depths of that despair, as the palace echoed with the sounds of Set's new brutal reign, something else began to stir within her. Beneath the waves of sorrow, a different fire was kindled. It was the cold, hard flame of resolve. Set had taken her husband. He had stolen her throne. He had plunged her world into darkness. But he had underestimated her. He had forgotten who she was. She was Isis, daughter of the earth and sky. She was the mistress of magic, the keeper of secret names, and she would not be broken. Her weeping subsided, replaced by a chilling, silent determination. She rose to her feet, her eyes no longer filled with tears, but with a purpose as vast and unyielding as the Nile itself. She would find him. She did not know how. She did not know where the great river had taken him. But she made a vow, not to the other gods, but to the fractured pieces of her own soul. She would walk the earth, she would search every river, every sea, every desolate shore. She would not rest, she would not sleep, she would not know peace until she had found the body of her beloved Osiris and brought him home. Her quest began that very night. Under the cold light of the moon, Isis slipped out of the palace, a ghost leaving her own life behind. She shed her identity as a queen, dressing in the simple dark robes of a grieving widow. She was alone. Her sister Nephthys, though loyal in her heart, was now a prisoner of her own husband, the new tyrant king. Isis had to rely on her own strength, her own magic, her own unbreakable will. She followed the banks of the Nile, her feet sinking into the mud, calling out her husband's name to the reeds and the crocodiles. She asked the river itself, begging it to tell her where it had taken him. She questioned the birds, the fish, the wind that rustled the papyrus. For weeks she wandered, a solitary figure of sorrow against the vast Egyptian landscape. Rumors and whispers followed her, tales of a grieving woman with divine eyes searching for a lost love. Some offered her food, others turned away in fear, not wanting to be associated with the deposed queen and incur the wrath of Set. Meanwhile, the chest that held the dead king was on its own journey. The powerful currents of the Nile carried it north, past the great cities of Memphis and Heliopolis, through the sprawling, fertile delta. It was a silent, grim passenger on the lifeblood of Egypt. The river that Osiris had taught his people to master had now become his unwilling accomplice in his own exile. Finally, the chest passed the last of the land and was swept out into the vast, churning expanse of the Great Green, what we now call the Mediterranean Sea. For days and nights it drifted on the open water, tossed by waves, bleached by the sun. It was a message in a bottle from a murdered god. The currents of the sea eventually carried it eastward, pushing it towards the coast of a foreign land, the city of Byblos in Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon. The chest washed ashore, lodging itself among the roots of a small, unassuming tamarisk sapling growing by the water's edge. And then a miracle. As if sensing the divine presence within the wood, the tamarisk tree began to grow at an unnatural rate. It shot upwards, its branches spreading wide, its trunk thickening with impossible speed. In a matter of hours, it grew into a colossal, magnificent tree, the likes of which had never been seen. And as it grew, its trunk completely enveloped the golden chest, sealing Osiris's body within its living wood. The tree was a wonder, straight and strong, and it gave off a faint, otherworldly perfume, a sweet scent that calmed the hearts of all who smelled it. News of this miraculous tree soon reached the royal palace of Byblos. The king, Malkander, and his queen Astarte came down to the shore to see it for themselves. They were awestruck. The king had never seen a tree so perfect, so majestic. He was in the process of building a new palace, and he knew at once that this tree must be its centerpiece. He ordered it to be cut down. His lumberjacks, with great effort, felled the mighty tamarisk. They did not know, could not have possibly known, that they were cutting into the tomb of a god. The tree was taken to the palace, where its branches were trimmed, its trunk was smoothed, and it was erected in the main hall as a great fragrant pillar to support the roof. Osiris, the king of Egypt, was now entombed once more, this time inside a column in a foreign king's court. Back in Egypt, Isis's relentless search continued. Her magic, her divine intuition, acted as a compass for her grief. She heard whispers on the wind, rumors from sailors and merchants about a miraculous tree in a distant land. A pull, an undeniable instinct, told her that her husband's fate was tied to this story. Following this fragile thread of hope, she journeyed out of Egypt, across the harsh desert, and finally, after a long and arduous trek, she arrived, weary and heartsick, at the gates of Byblos. She did not enter the city as a goddess or a queen. She was a picture of humility and sorrow. She went to the city well, the place where the women of the palace came to draw water, and she sat down on the stone edge, veiling her face and weeping silently. Soon the queen's own handmaidens arrived. They were intrigued by the mysterious, beautiful stranger. Isis, using her gentle magic, spoke with them. She learned of the king and queen, and of their infant son. As she spoke, she braided their hair, and with her touch, she imbued their hair with the divine fragrant scent of ambrosia that she had once shared with Osiris. When the handmaidens returned to the palace, Queen Astarte immediately noticed the incredible perfume wafting from their hair. She asked where it came from, and they told her of the sad, beautiful woman at the well. Intrigued, the queen summoned Isis to the court. Seeing the stranger's noble bearing despite her tattered clothes and profound sadness, Queen Astarte took pity on her. She did not know she was speaking to a goddess. She only saw a woman who had lost everything. The queen's own son, the young prince, had been sickly, and she felt a strange connection to this newcomer. She offered Isis a place in her household, as a nursemaid to the royal baby. Isis accepted. Her heart ached for her own child, Horus, who was yet to be conceived, a future stolen from her. But she knew she had to be patient. She had found her way inside the very palace that held the miraculous pillar, though she did not yet know its secret. Every day she would walk through the great hall, passing the colossal tamarisk column, feeling a strange, familiar sorrow emanating from the wood, a pull she couldn't yet understand. She was closer to her beloved than she had been in months, standing just feet away from him every single day, and yet she had no idea. She was a goddess in disguise, a secret agent of love and vengeance, waiting for the moment to uncover the truth. The days melted into weeks in the royal court of Byblos. To everyone, she was just a quiet, strangely wise old woman, a foreign nursemaid who had a preternatural gift for soothing the infant prince. Queen Astarte found herself relying on the old woman more and more, confiding in her, trusting her with the most precious thing in her life, her son and heir. Isis played her part perfectly. She was patient. She was observant. Every day she walked past the grand, fragrant pillar in the main hall, feeling the faint, almost imperceptible thrum of divine energy radiating from within. It was a constant, agonizing reminder of her purpose. She could feel Osiris's spirit, trapped and dormant, calling to her from his wooden prison. It took every ounce of her godly self-control not to tear the pillar down with her bare hands. But she knew that brute force would solve nothing. She needed leverage. She needed the queen to give her what she wanted willingly. And she found her opportunity in the very child she was hired to protect. The young prince was frail, constantly battling sickness. His mortal body was a fragile vessel. Isis, the great mother goddess, didn't just care for the boy. She came to love him as if he were her own. And in that love she saw a path. She wouldn't just heal him. She would give him a gift beyond any mortal imagining. She would make him immortal. She would burn away his mortal flesh and reforge him as a god, an eternal being, indebted to her forever. It was a staggering act of power and a brilliant political move, all wrapped in a gesture of love. So began the secret ritual. Every night, after the palace had fallen into a deep, trusting slumber, Isis would take the infant prince to a secluded room. There she would build a sacred fire, whispering ancient words of power that hadn't been spoken in that land for 1,000 years. And then she would do the unthinkable. She would place the child into the heart of the purifying flames. The fire, under her divine command, did not consume him. Instead, it licked away at his mortality, bit by bit, night after night, searing away his human weakness and fragility. During this terrifying rite, Isis would often transform into a swallow, flying around the pillar that held her husband, her mournful cries the only sound in the silent palace, a lament for her lost love and a hymn for the new god she was creating. But secrets, especially those kept by a goddess, have a way of making noise. Queen Astarte began to notice things. The strange, bird-like cries that echoed through the halls at the witching hour. the faint smell of sacred incense where none should be, and most of all, the peculiar behavior of the nursemaid, who seemed to guard the prince at night with a frightening intensity. A mother's intuition is a powerful force, and Astartes was screaming that something was wrong. She began to fear the old woman she had trusted so completely. Was she a witch? Was she placing a curse upon her child? One night, her fear overwhelmed her caution. She crept from her bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She followed the faint, flickering light and the low humming chant to the hidden chamber. She held her breath, pressed her ear to the heavy wooden door, and heard the crackle of a large fire. Terror, cold and sharp, seized her. She threw the door open, her mind bracing for some terrible dark magic. But what she saw was 1,000 times worse than anything she could have imagined. There, nestled in the heart of a roaring bonfire, was her son, the infant prince. A scream tore from Astartes' throat, a sound of pure primal horror. She didn't see magic or ritual. She saw her baby burning alive. She lunged forward, thrusting her hands into the flames, and snatched her child from the pyre. She clutched him to her chest, smothering the magical embers against her own body, sobbing, screaming at the old woman. "Monster! What are you doing to my son?" The instant the queen pulled the child from the fire, the spell was shattered. The ritual of immortality was broken, forever incomplete. The child was saved from the flames, but he was now denied eternity. He would live, but he would one day die just like any other man. In that moment of chaos and confrontation, Isis knew the charade was over. She rose to her full height, and the illusion of the frail old woman dissolved like mist in the morning sun. The stooped back straightened. The wrinkled skin grew smooth and radiant. The tattered rags transformed into the shimmering linens of a queen. Light and power exploded from her, filling the room with a terrifying divine presence. Before the astonished and petrified Queen Astarte stood no mortal woman, but Isis, the Queen of Egypt, the sister wife of a god, the most powerful sorceress in the cosmos. Her eyes, now glowing with cosmic fire, held not anger, but a profound sadness and pity. "You fool!" her voice boomed, echoing with the power of creation itself. "You have doomed him with your mortal fear. I was not harming your son. I was giving him the gift of eternity. I was burning away his mortality so that he might live forever as a god. And you, in your ignorance, have stolen that from him." Queen Astarte fell to her knees, clutching her son, trembling before the radiant, awesome being in front of her. She and her husband, the king, who had been awoken by the screams, could do nothing but stare in utter shock. They had welcomed a goddess into their home, and had completely failed to recognize her. Now that her true identity was revealed, Isis laid her mission bare. She told them everything. The story of her beloved husband, Osiris, the benevolent king who brought civilization to the world. She spoke of the bitter jealousy of his brother Set, the god of chaos. She described the horrific betrayal, the beautiful chest that became a coffin, and the murder that plunged the world into darkness. And then she pointed a shimmering finger toward the main hall. "My husband," she said, her voice thick with a grief that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. "The great King Osiris lies dead inside that pillar. The beautiful tree that you so admired grew around his coffin, trapping his body within. You have been living your lives, holding your feasts, and raising your son under a roof held up by the corpse of my king." The revelation struck the king and queen like a bolt of lightning. The centerpiece of their palace, the symbol of their kingdom's strength and prosperity, was a tomb, a divine tomb, overcome with awe, fear, and a desperate need to appease the powerful goddess they had unwittingly hosted. They immediately agreed to her request. Workmen were summoned. With the utmost care, they dismantled the section of the roof and gently, reverently, lowered the colossal tamarisk pillar. Under the watchful, tear-filled eyes of Isis, they began to carefully cut away the wood, stripping it back layer by layer. The air grew thick with the scent of tamarisk and something else, something ancient and sacred. The wood splintered, and then the axe struck something hard and ornate. There it was, the magnificent chest of acacia and gold, just as beautiful and terrible as the day she had last seen it. Isis let out a cry, a sound that was half sob, half triumph, and rushed forward. The long search was over. She fell to her knees and ran her hands over the cold, unfeeling surface of the coffin, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns her husband had once admired. She pressed her face against the lid, And for the first time in so long, she felt close to him. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root, hard and sharp as obsidian. The cold, calculating burn of vengeance. She had found him. She had her king back. The first, most impossible step was complete. But the long, dark road back to Egypt, and back to life itself, had only just begun. She had the pillar. Or rather, she knew where it was. But knowing and possessing are two very different things. How do you walk into a king's palace and ask for its central support column? How do you explain that the body of your murdered husband, a god-king from a foreign land, is entombed within the very heartwood of his great hall? You don't. You use the powers you have. Magic, yes, but also cunning, patience, and the desperate strength of a love that defies death itself. Isis did not burst into the throne room demanding her prize. Instead, she wove herself into the fabric of the court. She would sit near the queen's handmaidens, a silent, cloaked figure. But from her a divine fragrance emanated, the scent of ambrosia, of lotus, of the sacred sycamore tree. It perfumed her hair, her skin, her clothes. Soon, the queen's own ladies began to braid their hair like the mysterious stranger, hoping to capture a hint of that otherworldly scent. The queen of Byblos, Astarte, noticed. She was captivated. Who was this woman who smelled of heaven? She summoned Isis, who remained in her humble disguise, and asked her to serve in the palace. Specifically, she asked her to be the royal nursemaid to her youngest son, the infant prince. Isis, the great mother, the nurturer of all Egypt, agreed to care for this one small child. It was the perfect position. It gave her access, it gave her time, and it placed her right beside the pillar that held her entire world. Every night, in the quiet of the nursery, Isis cared for the child. But her care was not mortal. She didn't just feed the prince milk. She allowed him to suckle from her divine finger, infusing him with the ichor of the gods. And she did something more, something secret and terrifying. As the palace slept, Isis would build a great bonfire in the hall. She would seal the doors not with locks but with her magic. And then, she would place the queen's son into the heart of the purifying flames. This wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a gift of unimaginable power. She was burning away his mortality, forging him into an immortal, a being who would never know sickness or old age, or the cold grip of the grave. Night after night, the ritual continued. And as the flames licked away his mortal dross, Isis would transform herself. She would become a swallow, a tiny, swift bird, and she would fly endless, sorrowful circles around the great tamarisk pillar, her sharp cries the only sound in the night, the lament of a wife for her lost husband. But one night, Queen Astarte, driven by a mother's suspicion or perhaps just curiosity, managed to spy on the secret ritual. She peered into the hall and saw her baby, her precious son, lying in the center of a raging inferno. She didn't see a goddess performing a sacred rite. She saw a monster. She let out a scream of pure terror, a sound that shattered the magical silence. The spell was broken. Isis, furious and disappointed, snatched the child from the flames. He was unharmed, but the ritual was incomplete. He would not be immortal. "You fool!" she roared, and in that moment, her disguise of a humble nursemaid burned away like a phantom. She stood before the queen in her true form, a goddess radiant and terrible, crowned with the throne of Egypt, her eyes blazing with cosmic power and righteous anger. "Your son could have been eternal. He could have been like us. But your mortal fear has robbed him of his divinity." The king and queen of Byblos fell to their knees, trembling before the incandescent fury of the goddess who had been living under their roof. They understood now. They would give her anything. Anything. "The pillar," Isis commanded, her voice echoing with the authority of creation itself. "Give me the pillar." They obeyed without question. The court carpenters were summoned, and with painstaking care, they cut away the magnificent tamarisk column from the palace ceiling and floor. As they laid it down, a wave of the most beautiful, intoxicating perfume filled the hall, the divine scent of Osiris, released from his wooden prison at last. Isis fell upon the pillar, her hands caressing the wood, her tears staining its surface as she wailed a lament so profound it shook the souls of all who heard it. The carpenters carefully split the trunk, revealing the ornate, golden chest within. It was just as Set had designed it, a perfect prison. But it was no longer a prison. It was a holy relic, a sarcophagus. The king provided Isis with his finest royal barge, loaded it with priceless gifts, and watched as the goddess, her face a mask of grim purpose, began her long journey home across the Great Green, the Mediterranean Sea. The journey was a lonely vigil. Under the silent watch of the stars, Isis finally opened the chest. And there he was, Osiris, her brother, her husband, her king. His perfect form, untouched by decay, lay still and cold. She caressed his face, her fingers tracing the lines of the mouth that would never speak her name again. She held his lifeless hands, remembering their warmth, their strength. The grief was an ocean, and she was drowning in it. But she was not just a grieving wife. She was Isis, the mistress of magic. She had a duty that transcended even her own heartbreak. The line of succession had been broken. Egypt was without its rightful heir. Set, the usurper, the murderer, sat on the throne, and there was no one to challenge him. Not yet. She guided the barge not to the grand cities of Upper Egypt, but to the labyrinthine swamps of the Nile Delta. Here, in the thick papyrus marshes, under the cover of fog and the constant buzz of insects, she could hide. Her faithful sister, Nephthys, who had abandoned her monstrous husband Set, found her there. Together, the two goddesses guarded the body of the fallen king, their shared sorrow a shield against the world. And here, in this secret watery sanctuary, Isis performed her greatest act of magic. It was a spell that defied the laws of nature, a ritual that bent the boundary between life and death. She knew Osiris could not be truly resurrected yet. The pieces of the puzzle were not all in place. But she could borrow a moment. She could steal a single spark from the great darkness. She transformed herself, her body elongating, her arms becoming great feathered wings. She became a kite, the sacred bird of prey whose cry sounds like a mournful keen. She hovered over Osiris's still form, a living shadow against the moonlight. And she began to beat her wings. Not to fly, but to create a wind, a magical wind. With each powerful downstroke, she fanned the breath of life itself back into his lungs. She filled his inert body with her own magical essence, her divine life force. For one fleeting, impossible moment, Osiris lived again. His eyes did not open. He did not speak, but life, potent and divine, surged through him. And in that sacred, stolen moment, the goddess conceived a son. She conceived an heir. She conceived a king. She conceived an avenger. She conceived Horus. Her mission was complete. She had secured the future. She had created the weapon that would one day challenge Set and reclaim Egypt. Exhausted but triumphant, she carefully hid the chest containing Osiris's body deep within the reeds, and went to ensure her sister Nephthys was safe. But they were not alone in the delta. The moon, the great eye of the night, was full and bright, and by its silvery light, another figure was moving through the swamps. It was Set, out on a hunt for desert boar, his powerful form cutting through the reeds, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was restless, his victory feeling hollow, the silence of a pacified Egypt grating on his nerves. And then he caught it, a scent on the wind, faint but unmistakable, a divine fragrance that he had not smelled since the day of his treacherous feast, the scent of cedar and myrrh, the scent of kingship, the scent of his brother. His eyes narrowed, a predator catching the trail of its prey. He followed the scent, his heart pounding a war drum against his ribs. It led him deeper into the marsh, to a thicket of papyrus so dense it seemed impenetrable. And there, half submerged in the murky water, bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of the full moon, was the golden chest. His chest, the one he had built with his own hands, the one he had sealed with his own rage. He knew with a certainty that turned his blood to ice and fire, what and who was inside. The rage was a physical thing, a serpent coiling in his gut, its venom burning through his veins. For months he had been haunted, not by guilt but by a gnawing, insidious paranoia. He had felt Osiris's presence lingering on the wind, a ghost in the machine of the kingdom he now ruled. He'd seen it in the downcast eyes of the servants, in the whispered prayers of the priests. They had not forgotten, and it was her fault. Isis. Her grief was not the quiet, submissive sorrow of a widow. It was a silent, defiant act of war. He had torn the palace apart looking for the body. He had interrogated her handmaidens, threatened her priests, but found nothing. It was as if she had conjured the king's corpse out of thin air and spirited it away. And now this, hunting by the light of the full moon, a light that exposed all secrets. He had stumbled upon it. Not in a grand tomb, not in a hidden temple, but here, nestled among the papyrus reeds of the Nile Delta, as if it were common driftwood. The sheer audacity of it, hiding the sacred body of a god-king in a swamp, it was an insult of the highest order. He ripped at the lid of the golden chest. The wood, once so masterfully joined, splintered under the force of his divine fury. And there he was, Osiris, his brother. He looked peaceful, untouched by the violence of his death, unmarred by the dark waters of the Nile. Isis had done this. She had used her magic, her accursed spells to preserve him. His skin was not the gray of death, but held a pale, ethereal glow under the moonlight. He looked as if he were merely sleeping, dreaming of his sun-drenched kingdom. And that, more than anything, is what broke Set. It wasn't just that Osiris was dead. It was that even in death he was beloved. Even as a corpse he was whole. He was still the perfect king, the cherished husband, the one everyone mourned. While he, Set, the living king, was feared, hated, a usurper sitting on a cold throne. This chest wasn't a coffin, it was a shrine. A testament to a love that had outlasted his hatred. A love that sought to defy him, to undo his work. He looked at his brother's serene face and saw not a victim, but a rival who was still winning. Still mocking him from beyond the veil. The serpent in his gut uncoiled, and its venom was pure, distilled madness. If Isis wanted to worship a memory, he would shatter that memory into a million pieces. If she sought to make him whole, he would unmake him so completely that not even the gods could put him back together. He dragged the body from the chest, its cold weight a final, infuriating reminder of the life that had once inhabited it. This body had been strong. It had held the crook and flail. It had embraced Isis. It had held the adoration of an entire nation. Now it was just flesh and bone, a canvas for his rage. With a roar that was more beast than god, he began his work. This was not a frenzied attack. It was a cold, methodical, ritualistic desecration. He was the god of chaos, and he would bring chaos to the very form of his enemy. He would deconstruct the idea of Osiris. He would dismantle the symbol. He would tear apart the man, the king, the god, the husband, until nothing remained but scattered, meaningless fragments. He tore him into 14 pieces, one for every day of the waning moon. A permanent symbol of decline and decay. Each piece a victory, each cut a scream of triumph that echoed in his soul. He held up a severed hand, the hand that had once dispensed justice, and laughed. He looked at the heart, the vessel of intelligence and emotion, and felt a surge of power so absolute it was intoxicating. He was not just killing his brother again. He was erasing him from creation. He was rewriting the story, ensuring there would be no final chapter for Osiris. When it was done, he stood panting under the silver light of the moon, surrounded by the ruins of his brother. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply destroy the body. The pieces could be found. They could be gathered. No, they had to be lost. They had to become one with the land he now ruled, a permanent poison in the soil. He gathered the 14 pieces, his hands stained with the blood of his own blood, and he began a grim pilgrimage. He traveled the length of Egypt, from the southern cataracts to the northern delta. With each piece he performed a curse. He threw one part into the rushing waters of the Nile, to be carried away to the Great Sea. He buried another deep in the burning sands of the western desert, where no life could ever flourish. He cast a piece into a dark canyon, another into a fetid swamp. He scattered his brother across the kingdom they were meant to share. He salted the very earth with the body of its rightful king. Let the people of Egypt walk on the grave of their beloved Osiris every single day. Let them till the soil that held his flesh. Let them drink the water that carried his essence away into nothingness. Now he was truly gone. Now there was no hope of return. Now the throne was truly irrevocably his. Meanwhile, miles away, hidden in the deepest, most impenetrable marshes of the delta, a mother was quieting her child. Isis held the infant Horus to her breast, her heart a frantic drum against his tiny ear. Every shadow was a threat, every rustle of the reeds a footstep of the enemy. She had built a nest for them, a small secret world woven from papyrus and magic. Here she was not a queen, not a goddess of immense power. She was a fugitive, a single mother protecting her son from the most powerful being in the world. Horus was a miracle, a child of magic and memory, conceived after his father's death. He was her hope. He was Egypt's hope. He had his father's eyes, a deep, knowing green that seemed to hold the wisdom of the Nile itself. But he was so small, so vulnerable. She looked at his tiny, perfect hands, and a wave of terror washed over her. Set could not know he existed. If he ever discovered this child, this heir, he would show him no mercy. Her life was now a constant, vigilant prayer. Protect him. Keep him safe. Let him grow strong. But tonight the fear was different. It was a cold dread that had nothing to do with the snapping of a crocodile's jaw or the cry of a night bird. It was a disturbance in the fabric of magic itself, a tremor in her soul. She felt a sharp phantom pain, a tearing sensation, as if a bond deep within her had been violently ripped apart. She clutched her chest, a gasp escaping her lips. Osiris. Something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. The protective spell she had woven around his body, the wards of preservation she had so carefully placed, they were screaming. They were silent, but she could feel their echoes in her spirit, like the shattering of 1,000 mirrors. She laid Horus down in his makeshift cradle, whispering a quick prayer of protection over him. She had to go. She had to be sure. She moved through the swamp with a desperate urgency, her feet barely touching the murky water. The moon, once her ally, now seemed a cold, cruel observer, its light exposing her desperate flight. She reached the hidden grove, the place of safekeeping, and her world ended for a second time. The golden chest, her husband's beautiful sarcophagus, was smashed to splinters. It lay in a heap, a monument to Set's bottomless rage. And it was empty. The silks were torn, the sacred herbs scattered, but of Osiris there was nothing, not a trace. For a wild, frantic moment, she thought maybe he had been stolen, taken. But she knew Set. He was not a thief. He was a destroyer. He wouldn't just take the body. He would defile it. He would annihilate it. A low, guttural sound of pure anguish escaped her throat. It was a sound no queen or goddess should ever make. It was the sound of a soul being flayed. He was gone. The hope she had so painstakingly nurtured, the plan she had set in motion to restore him, it had all turned to ash. Set had found him. And in his jealousy, in his infinite cruelty, he had done the unthinkable. She didn't need to see it to know. She could feel it. The land itself felt wounded. The Nile wept. Her husband was not just gone. He was scattered. He was lost. An impossible puzzle of flesh and bone, spread across a kingdom that was now her prison. The task before her was no longer one of resurrection. It was one of reclamation. A desperate, hopeless search for the 14 scattered pieces of her murdered love. The land of Egypt, once a reflection of divine order, had become a vast, unmarked grave. Every rustle of reeds in the Nile Delta, every shadow cast by a dune in the western desert, whispered of a hidden horror. For Isis, the journey began not with a map, but with a scream trapped in her throat. Where do you even begin to look for the fragments of a god? A kingdom is not a room. It is a sprawling, living entity of cities and farms, of rivers and mountains, of people loyal to a new, cruel king. Every step she took was on soil ruled by her husband's murderer. Every face she saw could be an informant, a spy for Set. She walked. She walked until her divine feet were raw and bleeding, the dust of the common roads caking her skin. She disguised herself, a queen reduced to a beggar, a goddess cloaked in the rags of a mortal widow. Her search was a prayer, a desperate incantation spoken with every footstep. She followed whispers, rumors, the strange behavior of animals. She listened to the flow of the river, hoping it would carry a secret to her. Days bled into weeks. The hope that had burned so fiercely in her heart began to flicker, threatening to be extinguished by the sheer, crushing scale of her task. She found nothing. The land, defiled by Set's act, held its secrets tight. One evening, huddled in a marsh, weeping in exhaustion and despair, she felt a presence. Not the menacing shadow of Set's soldiers, but something familiar. A sorrow that mirrored her own. From the reed stepped Nephthys, her sister. Her face was a mask of guilt, her eyes swollen from her own endless tears. She, the wife of the murderer, had abandoned his palace of stolen gold and blood-soaked stone. She could not live with the silence, with the ghost of the good king her husband had slaughtered. She knelt before Isis, not as a goddess, but as a sister begging for a chance at redemption. She had been weak, she had been silent, but she would be silent no longer. In that moment of shared grief, their bond was reforged. They were no longer the wives of opposing forces. They were two sisters against a tyrant, united in a singular sacred mission. The search was transformed. Where Isis had one pair of eyes, now there were two. Where one's hope faltered, the other's held strong. Nephthys, as Set's wife, knew the patterns of his cruelty, the dark places in his heart. She could guess where he might have cast the pieces, imagining the profane satisfaction he would take in scattering them in places both holy and foul. They were joined by others. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and magic, appeared to them not in person, but in inspiration. He guided their thoughts, planting knowledge in their minds like seeds, helping them decipher the cryptic patterns of Set's madness. Anubis, the jackal god of the afterlife, who had a deep, instinctual connection to the dead, could sense the faint echoes of Osiris's divine energy. He led them through winding paths and forgotten corners of the kingdom. Their first discovery was near the city of Memphis. An arm, the very arm that had held the crook and flail, symbols of kingship and fertility. Isis collapsed, cradling the cold, lifeless limb as if it were a newborn child. It was a victory soaked in the agony of what it represented. A part, not the whole. A memory, not a life. But it was a start. It proved that the task was not impossible. Their quest became a grim pilgrimage. They traveled south to the great temples and found a leg near Abydos, the sacred city that Osiris himself had loved. They ventured into the sweltering, crocodile-infested swamps of the Fayum, and there, tangled in the roots of a papyrus thicket, was another piece. Each discovery was a ritual of pain and reverence. They would find a fragment of their beloved king, and together Isis and Nephthys would weep. They would wash the piece in sacred oils, wrap it in the finest linen they could find, and perform the ancient rites, their voices a mournful harmony that echoed through the desolate landscapes. They were collecting the shattered syllables of a god, hoping to one day speak his name and have him answer. They found his chest, the broad, strong torso that had been a shield for his people. They found his hands, the hands that had taught humanity agriculture and law. They found his feet, which had walked the length of the land, bringing peace and prosperity. With each piece they reclaimed, a sliver of light returned to the world. The people, seeing the two goddesses on their holy mission, began to whisper. Hope, a dangerous and forbidden thing in the age of Set, began to stir in the hearts of mortals. They would leave offerings of food and water for the sisters, a silent act of rebellion against the Dark King. 12 pieces, then 13. They had gathered nearly all of him. The body lay upon a stone slab in a hidden cave, almost whole. The divine flesh, preserved by its own nature and the sisters' powerful magic, was being meticulously reassembled. Isis, the great healer, the mistress of magic, began to weave her spells, stitching him back together not just with thread, but with incantations, with whispered promises, with the sheer, unyielding force of her will. The air in the cave crackled with power. The form of Osiris, the once and future king, was taking shape. Only one piece remained, the 14th piece, the most vital, the phallus, the symbol of his fertility, his power to create life, the very source of his lineage and the promise of a future. Without it, he could never be a complete god again. Without it, he could never father the heir who was prophesied to reclaim the throne. An incomplete king could not rule the underworld. An incomplete husband could not give his wife a son. Everything depended on this final sacred piece. They searched with a new frenzy, a desperate energy born of near success. They retraced their steps, consulted with Thoth, followed the senses of Anubis to the very ends of the earth. But the land was silent. The river gave up no secrets. The trail went cold. It was as if the piece had vanished from existence. It was a humble fisherman who unknowingly delivered the final devastating blow. He told them a strange story. Weeks ago, near the city of Oxyrhynchus, the fish in the Nile had behaved strangely. They had swarmed, feeding on something large and unnatural that had been thrown into the water. He spoke of a particular species of fish, one that the gods themselves had cursed, forbidding it from being eaten. This fish, he said, had consumed what was cast into the river. The truth crashed down upon Isis with the force of a tidal wave. Set, in his ultimate act of desecration, had not just scattered his brother. He had sought to erase him from the future. He had thrown the symbol of Osiris's legacy into the Nile, where it was immediately devoured. The 14th piece was not merely lost. It was gone, destroyed, consumed and absorbed back into the chaos of nature, forever beyond their reach. After all the searching, all the pain, all the hope, they were left with this: an incomplete God, a broken promise. The puzzle could never be finished. The king could be reassembled, but he could never be made whole. Resurrection, true and complete, was now impossible. The dream of a natural heir, of a son to avenge his father and restore balance to the world, died in that moment, on the muddy banks of the Nile. The path to vengeance was gone. The future was a void. And in that void, Isis was faced with a choice: accept the final victory of Set, or defy the very laws of creation itself. To accept defeat is to die a second time. It is to let the enemy carve his name not just on your tombstone, but on your very soul. And Isis, the goddess of 1,000 names, the mistress of magic, would not allow Set to claim her soul. She looked at the small, still body of her son, the hope of Egypt, and a fire ignited in her heart that was hotter than the sun god Ra's own chariot. It was a fire forged in grief, but fueled by pure, undiluted rage. She would not mourn. Mourning was for the defeated. She would wage war. A war not with armies and spears, but with incantations and will. A war against the established order, against the finality of death itself. What do you do when the universe itself tells you it's over? When the gods who are supposed to uphold justice turn a blind eye? You don't pray to them. You go over their heads. You find the one being who wrote the rules in the first place. You find Thoth, the god of wisdom, the scribe of the universe, the master of magic and knowledge. He who understood the secret language of creation, the very syntax of reality. But Thoth did not reside in the palaces of the gods, meddling in their petty squabbles. He dwelled in the quiet places, in the libraries of the cosmos, where the only sound was the rustling of papyrus scrolls containing the fate of stars. Isis, cradling her son's lifeless form wrapped in linen, began her journey. This was not a journey across land, but a journey through planes of existence. She moved through the whispers of the living and the silence of the dead, her will carving a path where none existed. She found Thoth in a hall woven from moonlight and mathematics, where every pillar was a column of unspoken truths. He didn't look up when she entered. His ibis head was bent over a scroll where he was calculating the precise moment a distant sun would go supernova. He already knew why she was there. To him, the past, present, and future were simply different clauses in the same cosmic sentence. "He is gone," Thoth said, his voice like the turning of a stone page. The venom of the scorpion was a thread woven into his fate. It has been fulfilled. His words were not cruel, merely factual. They were the words of a doctor reading a chart, not a god offering comfort. Isis laid Horus down on an altar of polished obsidian. "Fate," she hissed, the word a poison on her own tongue, "is a story you have written. And any story can be edited. You hold the pen, Lord of Knowledge. I am asking you to write a new chapter." Thoth finally looked at her. His eyes were deep and ancient, holding the light of stars that had died 1,000,000,000 years before. To undo a death is to unravel the tapestry, creates a paradox, a loose thread that could pull apart the whole of creation. The price is too high. Ma'at, the cosmic balance, would be shattered. This was the moment, the negotiation for the soul of her son, for the future of the world. Isis was not a weeping mother now. She was a queen, a scholar, a sorceress on par with any being in existence. "Balance," she challenged, her voice ringing with power. "You speak of balance? Where is the balance in a usurper sitting on the throne? Where is the balance in a king murdered by his own brother? Where is the balance in a child, the rightful heir, struck down in a swamp before he can even speak his own name? What you call balance, Thoth, is a coward's peace. It is the quiet of the tomb. Set has already shattered Ma'at. I am not asking you to break the rules. I am asking you to restore them. Horus's death is the true paradox. His life is the correction." Thoth was silent for a long time. He saw the logic in her words, the fire in her spirit. He saw that this was not just about one child, one goddess. This was about the fundamental principle of the universe. That order must, in the end, triumph over chaos. That light must have its chance to push back the darkness. He had written the laws, but he had also written the loopholes. For every rule there was an exception. For every poison an antidote. For every death a path back, for those with the will to walk it. The venom is not merely a substance, Thoth explained, his tone shifting from cosmic arbiter to master magician. It is a piece of Isfit of chaos made manifest. To heal the body is not enough. You must purge the chaos from his soul. You must call his Ren, his true name, back from the shores of the underworld. You must reweave his Ba, his personality, and bind it again to his Ka, his life force. This requires magic older than the gods themselves. He did not perform the ritual for her. He was the librarian, not the hero of the story. He gave her the scroll. It was a papyrus that seemed to drink the light from the room, covered in hieroglyphs that writhed and shifted like living things. It contained a spell of such power that to even speak it aloud would age a mountain range. It was the secret of life and death, the ultimate defiance. Isis returned to the swamps, to the place of her deepest despair, now the stage for her greatest gamble. She laid Horus out under the light of the moon. She called upon the spirits of the air and the earth. She called upon the power flowing in her own divine blood. And then, she began to read from the scroll of Thoth. The words were not a language, they were a force. As she spoke them, the air grew thick and heavy. The water of the Nile stopped flowing. The stars in the sky seemed to hold their breath. She was not just speaking words. She was issuing commands to reality itself. She spoke of the first time, the moment of creation, and invoked its power. She named the secret names of the sun and the moon, bending them to her will. She reached out with her magic, a thread of golden light, and cast it into the darkness of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. She was fishing for a soul. She could feel the cold emptiness of that realm, the despair of the truly lost. She felt other spirits clawing at her magic, desperate for a second chance. But she pushed them aside, her focus absolute, calling out the true name of her son, a name only she knew. Horus, come back to your mother. Her call echoed across the plains of death. And in the infinite darkness, a tiny spark flickered. It was him. His soul, his Ba, recognized her voice. She pulled. The forces of the underworld pulled back. It was a cosmic tug of war. A grieving mother against the entire concept of death. Her own life force drained away, her skin growing pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She poured everything she was, everything she had, into that single desperate act of love and defiance. And then, with a silent thunderclap that shook the foundations of the world, the thread snapped back. The spark of Horus's soul flew from the underworld, back across the veil, and slammed into his small body. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than before. Had she failed? Had she only succeeded in damning them both? Then a finger twitched. A tiny gasp of air. Horus's eyes snapped open. But they were not the innocent eyes of the child who had died. They were ancient. In his brief time in the Duat, he had seen things no mortal and few gods were ever meant to see. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. The boy was gone. In his place lay something else. He sat up, the scorpion's mark faded from his skin, replaced by a faint golden glow. He looked at his mother, not with the love of a child, but with the focused intensity of a king, an avenger who now understood his purpose. Isis had done it. She had defied creation and won. She had brought her son back. But in doing so, she had rung a bell that could not be unrung. Miles away, in his palace built on betrayal and shadow, Set felt it. A tremor in the fabric of magic. A surge of power where there should have been only a void. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why. He only knew one thing for certain. The child was alive, and the hunt was on again. Set's paranoia, once a simmering ember, now roared into a wildfire. His spies, a network of whispers and shadows, fanned out across the two lands. Every strange light in the sky, every child born with unusual promise, was reported back to the throne. He tore apart villages on the word of a frightened peasant who thought they saw a goddess in the twilight. He interrogated priests and seers, his questions laced with threats, demanding to know where the heir of Osiris was hidden. The land of Egypt, already groaning under the weight of a usurper, now held its breath in terror. Set's fear was a poison, seeping into the very soil, and everyone was a suspect. But how do you hide a god? How do you shield a beacon of nascent power from the all-seeing eye of a paranoid tyrant? Isis knew she couldn't stay in one place. She became a ghost, a myth whispered on the wind. With her infant son clutched to her chest, she fled into the deepest, most impenetrable parts of the Nile Delta, into the labyrinthine swamps of Chemis. Here, the papyrus reeds grew so thick they blotted out the sun, creating a world of green twilight. The water was a black mirror, disturbed only by the silent glide of a crocodile or the splash of a fish. For any other, this was a place of death, teeming with venomous snakes, stinging insects, and predators lurking beneath the surface. For Isis and Horus, it was the perfect cradle. It was a sanctuary of primal life, a place Set's ordered armies and polished courtiers would never dare to tread. Here, Isis raised her son not as a prince, but as a child of the wild. Horus's first playmates were not other children, but the ibis and the kingfisher. His first lessons were not in statecraft but in survival. He learned the language of the rustling reeds, the silent patience of the heron, the lightning strike of the crocodile. He learned to move without a sound, to read the water and the sky, to feel the pulse of the living world around him. His mother, the greatest magician in existence, taught him the secret names of the creatures of the swamp, giving him dominion over them. He was a king in a kingdom of mud and water, his divinity growing in secret, nurtured by the raw, untamed magic of the Delta. But Set's malice was a long and patient thing. He could not find the child with his eyes, so he sent his venom to find him instead. One sweltering afternoon, as Horus slept in a humble reed basket while Isis was away gathering food, one of Set's agents, a monstrous scorpion dark as obsidian and filled with the desert god's hatred, crept from the shadows. It slipped into the basket and plunged its stinger deep into the flesh of the young god. When Isis returned, she was met with a horrifying silence. Her son lay still, his face pale, his breath a shallow whisper. A single dark mark on his skin told the story. The child was dying, the divine fire within him being extinguished by a mortal poison infused with the god's hatred. A wail of pure, unadulterated anguish tore from Isis's throat, a sound that silenced the swamp, that made the crocodiles sink into the depths and the birds fall silent in the trees. This was not the cry of a goddess. It was the cry of a mother who had lost her husband and was now losing her only child, the last hope for a broken world. Her grief was so immense, her despair so absolute, that it stopped the very flow of life. It is said that on that day, the sunboat of Ra halted in the sky. The wind ceased to blow. The Nile itself stopped flowing towards the sea. The entire cosmos paused, holding its breath in the face of her sorrow. Her cry for help was not a prayer, but a demand to the universe to right this unbearable wrong. And the universe answered. The wise god Thoth, master of knowledge and magic, descended from the heavens. He saw the child, the grieving mother, the frozen world. He knew this was not just a family tragedy. It was a cosmic crisis. If the heir of Osiris died, the principle of divine order of Ma'at would be shattered forever. Set would win. Thoth spoke to Isis, his voice calm and steady amidst her storm of grief. He told her that her magic, combined with his knowledge, could conquer this evil. He taught her a powerful incantation, a spell of such potency that it could command the poison to retreat, to unmake its own deadly work. Standing over her son's still form, Isis gathered every ounce of her power. She drew on her love, her rage, her desperation. She spoke the words of power Thoth had given her, and her voice was no longer that of a grieving mother, but of a cosmic force. She commanded the poison, a creature of Set's darkness, to leave the body of the son of Osiris. She invoked the name of Ra, the sun god, whose light is the enemy of all venom and darkness. The magic surged through the swamp, a wave of pure, life-giving energy. Slowly, miraculously, the color returned to Horus's cheeks. His chest rose with a deep, shuddering breath. He opened his eyes, and in them, the divine spark burned brighter than ever before. He was saved. The world could breathe again. Ra's boat continued its journey, and the Nile resumed its course. This was the turning point. The moment Horus survived Set's venom was the moment he ceased to be merely a child in hiding. The attack proved two things: that Set would never stop hunting him, and that Horus was destined to survive. Isis knew then that she could no longer just protect her son, she had to prepare him. The lessons of the swamp, of survival and nature, were not enough. He needed to learn the ways of gods and kings. As Horus grew from a boy into a young man, his training began in earnest. His mother was his first and greatest teacher. She taught him the magic she had used to bring his father back from the dead, the spells of protection, the words of power that could command the elements. She told him the story of his father, not as a gentle bedtime tale, but as a brutal, searing account of betrayal. She painted a vivid picture of Osiris's goodness, of the golden age he had ruled, and then she described in cold and furious detail how Set had tricked him, murdered him, and scattered his body across the land. She made him feel the weight of his father's stolen throne, the pain of a kingdom suffering under a tyrant. She planted the seed of vengeance in his heart, but tempered it with the steel of justice. He was not to be a mere killer like Set. He was to be a restorer of order, a rightful king. His body was hardened by the harsh life of the Delta, but now he began to train it for war. He learned to wield a spear with the speed of a striking cobra, to draw a bow with the strength of a lion. He wrestled with crocodiles in the murky water, and raced against the swiftest gazelles on the banks. He was becoming a perfect warrior, a living weapon forged in secrecy. His divine nature began to blossom. He found he could take the form of a falcon, soaring high above the canopy of reeds, his sharp eyes seeing for miles. From this vantage point he could see the edges of his swamp sanctuary, and beyond it, the land of Egypt, his stolen birthright. He saw the monuments to Set, the suffering of the people, the darkness that had fallen over his father's kingdom, and the fire in his soul burned hotter. The time for hiding was drawing to a close. The boy who was stung by the scorpion, the child who played with the creatures of the swamp, was fading into memory. In his place stood a young god, his eyes burning with purpose, his body honed into a weapon, and his heart filled with the magic of his mother and the rage of his murdered father. He was the son of Isis. He was the heir of Osiris. He was Horus, and he was finally ready. The swamp had been his cradle, his school, and his fortress. But it was about to become his staging ground for the greatest war the gods had ever known. Horus emerged from the reeds not as a boy, but as a god honed to a single razor-sharp purpose. The years of hiding, of learning from Thoth and his mother, had forged him into a being of immense power. His eyes, one representing the sun and the other the moon, burned with a righteous fire that had been stoked since his birth. He carried the strength of the sky, the cunning of his mother, and the divine right of his father. He was the living embodiment of vengeance, the rightful heir stepping out of the shadows and into the light. But this would not be a simple assassination in the dark, a repeat of the treachery that had started it all. Horus was the son of Osiris, the bringer of order. His claim would be made not with a whispered threat, but with a roar that would shake the pillars of heaven. He traveled to the great hall of the gods, where the Ennead, the divine tribunal, was assembled. He strode past the lesser deities, his gaze fixed on the two most powerful beings in the pantheon, the ancient sun god Ra, head of the council, and his great-uncle Set, the murderer, seated on the throne that was not his. The air crackled with tension. The silence was absolute. Horus stood before them, his presence a challenge in itself. He did not need to speak his lineage. It was written in the regal bearing of his falcon head, in the very aura of divine kingship that radiated from him. He was here to claim his inheritance. He was here to demand justice for his father. Set sneered, his voice a low growl that echoed with the chaos of the desert storm. He looked at Horus not as a nephew, but as an inconvenience, an upstart. He argued before the assembled gods that Horus was nothing. A bastard child, he claimed, conceived in trickery after Osiris was already dead. How could a ghost father a king? He painted Isis as a manipulative sorceress and Horus as her illegitimate puppet. He then championed his own strength. Who but Set had the raw power to stand on the prow of Ra's solar barge each night and beat back the great serpent of chaos, Apep? He was the strong arm of the pantheon, the necessary evil that kept the ultimate darkness at bay. Egypt needed a ruler of strength, he bellowed, not a sheltered boy raised in a swamp. Isis, ever the protector, stepped forward to defend her son. Her voice, filled with the power of magic and the unshakable certainty of a mother's love, cut through Set's blustering accusations. She recounted the story of Set's betrayal, the murder of his own brother, the dismemberment of the corpse. She presented Horus not as a child, but as the living will of Osiris, the rightful heir conceived through a love so powerful it transcended death itself. Her arguments were sharp, her evidence undeniable, but the gods were divided. Some were swayed by Set's claims of strength and stability. Even Ra, the great sun god, seemed hesitant. He valued Set's role in protecting his nightly journey through the underworld. To depose him was to risk cosmic instability. Others, led by the wise god Thoth, argued for Ma'at, for the divine order. The throne belonged to the son of the first king. It was a matter of cosmic law, not brute strength. The divine court was deadlocked. The debate raged not for days or weeks but for 80 long years. 80 years of legal battles, of celestial arguments, of accusations and defenses. Horus, who had entered the hall of fiery youth, felt the slow grind of divine bureaucracy wear on his patience. He saw the smirk on Set's face, the usurper enjoying every moment of the delay. Every second he remained on the throne. Vengeance was being choked by procedure. Justice was being lost in debate. Finally, the gods, unable to reach a verdict, declared that the matter could only be settled by a trial of combat. A series of contests would be held to prove which of them was the more worthy, the more powerful ruler. Set, a god of brute force and violence, roared with approval. This was a language he understood far better than law. The first contest was a race in boats made of stone. Set, ever the pragmatist, sawed down a mighty pine tree and coated its hull with plaster to resemble granite. He launched his seemingly impossible vessel and laughed as it floated. Horus, however, used his cunning. He built his boat from wood, but painted it to look exactly like stone. His boat, much lighter, easily won the race. When Set discovered the trick, he flew into a rage, transforming himself into a monstrous hippopotamus and attacking Horus's boat, shattering it to pieces. The conflict escalated. Another contest was decreed. They would both transform into hippopotami and submerge themselves in the Nile. The first one to surface would lose the contest and the throne. They plunged into the dark waters, two colossal beasts locked in a battle of endurance. Days passed. Isis, watching from the riverbank, feared for her son. She could not bear the thought of losing him as she had lost her husband. In a moment of maternal panic, she fashioned a magical harpoon, intending to strike Set and give her son the advantage. Her first throw missed, striking Horus by mistake. He surfaced, roaring in pain and fury, his skin pierced by his own mother's weapon. Isis, horrified, used her magic to heal him instantly and cast the harpoon again. This time it found its mark, sinking deep into the blubbery hide of Set. The god of chaos surfaced, bellowing in agony, and the sound was so pitiful, so desperate, that Isis's heart was moved. He was still her brother. In a moment of compassion she could not control, she released Set from the spell, and the harpoon fell away. Horus exploded from the water, his eyes blazing with betrayal. His mother, the one who had sacrificed everything for him, had just spared the life of his father's murderer. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he lunged at her, his youthful fury overriding all reason, and with a single swipe of his blade, he decapitated his own mother. The gods recoiled in horror. Thoth, in an instant, magically replaced Isis's head with that of a cow, saving her life, but the damage was done. Horus, shamed and enraged, fled into the desert to be alone. Set saw his chance. He hunted Horus down, finding him asleep under a palm tree. And there, in the quiet of the desert, the god of chaos showed his true nature. He was not a warrior seeking an honorable victory. He was a butcher. He pinned his nephew down, and with his bare hands, he gouged out Horus's eyes. He tore the sun and the moon from his nephew's skull, a brutal final act of dominance. He then cut the eyes into 6 pieces each and scattered them across the sands of Egypt. Leaving the blinded, broken god to die, Set returned to the divine court. He declared that he had searched for Horus, but the boy was nowhere to be found. He had clearly fled in shame, forfeiting the contest. For a moment it seemed as if the war was over. The usurper had won. The rightful heir was left bleeding and sightless in the wilderness, the light of the sun and the moon extinguished, and darkness was poised to rule over the land of Egypt forever. But in the depths of that despair, a different kind of magic was at work. Not the brutal, chaotic magic of Set, but the precise, ancient wisdom of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of knowledge. He found Horus in the desert, a broken prince shrouded in his own blood and failure. Thoth, who had recorded the creation of the universe, knew that some things once broken could be made whole again, and stronger than before. He gathered up the shattered pieces of Horus's eyes, the right eye which held the power of the sun, and the left, which held the cool silver light of the moon. With spells older than the pyramids and incantations that echoed the first words of creation, Thoth began to weave them back together. He spat upon the fragments, a sacred act of divine creation, and the pieces began to knit. The right eye reformed, blazing with the fury of 1,000 noonday suns. But the left eye, the lunar eye, was not quite perfect. A tiny piece was missing, forever lost to the sands. And so the moon would never again shine with the same steady, perfect light as the sun, but would wax and wane for all eternity, a permanent scar and a reminder of the cost of this war. When Horus opened his newly restored eyes, the world was different. He saw not just with sight but with understanding. He saw the sun not just as a ball of fire, but as the engine of life and order. He saw the moon not as a lesser light, but as the master of time, tides, and secrets. He was no longer just a sun seeking revenge. He was the embodiment of cosmic balance, the living union of solar and lunar power. He had been wounded, blinded, and left for dead, but he had returned with a power that Set, in all his brute strength, could never comprehend. The final confrontation was inevitable. It was not a battle, it was a cataclysm. Horus descended from the heavens as a great falcon, his shadow covering the land. Set met him as a storm, a monstrous creature of nightmare with the body of a dog and the head of something that had no name. They clashed over the fields of Egypt, and the very gods watched in terror. Their blows were not of fists, but of mountains hurled through the air. Their shouts were not of voices, but of thunder that split the sky. Horus commanded the light, searing Set with the focused power of the sun. Set commanded the darkness, the sand, the unforgiving desert, trying to choke and blind his nephew. For days and nights they fought, until the land itself was scarred and broken from their struggle. In a final desperate act, Set transformed into a massive hippopotamus, a creature of immense strength and chaos, and tried to sink Horus's boat in the Nile. But Horus, with his new sight and wisdom, was prepared. He struck with a great harpoon of divine bronze, piercing Set's skull. The god of chaos roared, a sound that made the world tremble, and was finally decisively defeated. Horus stood over his uncle, ready to deliver the final blow, to end the cycle of violence that had begun with the murder of his father. But before he could strike, the other gods intervened. This was not a simple blood feud to be ended with a spear. This was a question of cosmic law, of the divine right to rule. The matter had to be settled not by strength, but by judgment. They were brought before the great Ennead, the tribunal of the most powerful gods, presided over by Ra himself, the ancient king of the sky. The trial began. Set, ever the arrogant powerhouse, made his case first. He argued from a position of strength. He was the thunder, the storm, the untamed power of the desert. He had proven his might. Rulership, he claimed, belongs to the strongest. Why should the throne be given to a mere boy, an unproven child? Some of the gods, who valued power above all else, nodded in agreement. Then it was Horus's turn. Guided by the wisdom of his mother Isis and Thoth, he did not speak of strength. He spoke of lineage. He was the son of Osiris, the first and rightful king. He spoke of Ma'at, the sacred principle of order, truth, and cosmic justice. To give the throne to a murderer, a usurper, was to spit in the face of creation itself. It would validate chaos over order, and Egypt would crumble. The gods were divided. The argument raged for 80 years, a testament to the fundamental conflict between might and right. The stalemate seemed unbreakable. Ra favored the strong and decisive Set, while others championed the legitimate heir, Horus. Finally, in a moment of brilliant insight, the gods decided to ask the one person whose opinion mattered most. They penned a letter, a divine message, and sent it down into the Duat, the land of the dead, to be delivered to the king who reigned there, Osiris. From the silent, shadowy throne of the underworld, Osiris's reply came. His voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, yet it carried an authority that silenced every god in the chamber. He spoke of his son, the rightful heir. But he did not simply plead. He asked a question that cut to the very heart of justice. Why, his message read, has my son been robbed? Will you God stand by and allow the throne of Egypt to be passed to the very being who murdered me and cast my body into the Nile? Then came the threat. Osiris, as lord of the underworld, was the source of all life that springs from the earth. He reminded them that he commanded legions of demonic messengers, servants of life and death. If they did not deliver justice for his son, he would unleash his messengers upon the world of the living. He would shut the gates of the underworld, the crops would fail, the land would starve, and the world of the gods and men would wither into a barren wasteland. No one would be able to join him in the afterlife, and the entire cosmic order would collapse. The threat was absolute. The gods had no choice. Ra, seeing the wisdom and the power in Osiris's judgment, finally relented. The verdict was unanimous. The Ennead declared Horus, son of Osiris, the one true and rightful king of all Egypt. Set was brought forward in chains, but he was not destroyed. The Egyptians understood that chaos could never be truly eliminated from the universe. It could only be controlled and given purpose. So Set was exiled, but he was also given a new vital role. He was tasked to stand on the prow of Ra's solar bark, the boat that carried the sun across the sky each day, and use his immense strength to fight off Apep, the great serpent of chaos who tried to swallow the sun each night. The destructive force was harnessed to protect creation, and Horus at last claimed his birthright. In a grand ceremony before all the gods, he was crowned. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt were placed upon his head, and for the first time they were worn together as one, the double crown. He was no longer just Horus, the son of Isis. He was Horsimatai, Horus, uniters of the two lands. Under his rule, Maat was restored. The Nile flowed in its proper season, the harvests were bountiful, and the age of chaos was over. The land was healed. This wasn't just a story the Egyptians told. It was the blueprint for their entire civilization. Every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne of Egypt was not just a king. He was the living Horus, the earthly incarnation of the god who conquered chaos and established divine order. The struggle between Horus and Set was the eternal struggle they saw all around them. The order of the fertile Nile Valley against the chaos of the desert, the light of day against the darkness of night, life against death. The story of Osiris became their promise of resurrection and eternal life. The story of Isis became their ideal of devotion, magic, and motherhood. And the story of Horus became their guarantee of civilization itself. It is a story that teaches that justice can be delayed but not denied, that even after being broken and blinded, one can return with a clearer vision, and that the most important battles are fought not just for revenge, but for order, for legacy, and for the future. It is a story that is not just written in papyrus, but carved into stone, and echoed in the very soul of human civilization, that even in the deepest darkness, the eye of the sun will always eventually return.